alarming. It's far less alarming nowadays, given that that proportion of federal revenue is much smaller. Now, that said, we could be using $46 billion in many other ways were we not saddled with this kind of debt. So I guess there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Overall, it's not a huge number, nor is it a huge number in terms of the historical backdrop, but $46 billion nevertheless is more than what is allocated for national defence, more than what is earmarked for elderly benefits, and it's a tad less than what the federal government gives to the provinces for healthcare services, and including the budget for healthcare in Quebec, says Ms. Vinola.
Luis, please, back to you, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thank you, Mr. Giroux, to you and your whole team for working with us today in this study. And I get the sense that one can ask, finally, questions that have to do with the actual mandate of this committee today, which is a relief. Now, Mr. Giroux, there's a huge housing crisis that's been getting worse over the years, and I'd like to hone in on, and I want this to be in the committee's minutes and transcript, this crisis is even worse in the First Nations communities. And we're having trouble meeting our objectives in terms of providing housing, both in terms of number and quality housing, to Indigenous communities. Now, in 2015, 2022, it went from 20.8% to 17.5% of First Nation homes that require major renovations and retrofitting. The number of houses that need to be replaced hasn't gone down, it's increased over the same period. And as far as the building new housing units is concerned, only 20% of the total volume required to make up for to be in line with the Canadian average. So in terms of building housing units, it's going to, the budget envelope will be going up modestly. Now, how do you feel that the federal government can actually attain the objectives that it set for 2023 with those kinds of cutbacks to Indigenous housing? Well, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't think that I'm the person who's best placed to respond to that question. i.e., how should we attain those objectives or meet the needs of the First Nations and their housing? I think that you might get a better answer from the Minister for Indigenous Services. Well, do you have a sense, have you assessed the total investment that would be required to offset that discrepancy? Now, we have reported on the housing needs of Indigenous peoples in terms of the investment required by the federal government, and I think that we took into account their needs when it comes to water and sewage systems in First Nations communities in recent years, but I'm not sure that we specifically reported on First Nations housing needs. I can get back to you on that with an answer, a written answer, if you see fit. Yes, I'd very much like that. I know that you have your work cut out for you, but that kind of information will help us in our work and help us develop better public policies for Inuit and First Nations communities. Now, I'd like to turn to a different issue. There's the whole Arrive scam, ArriveCan scandal. Now, exorbitant, sometimes even scandalous costs of outsourcing, and the Auditor General talked about the double or triple the cost that the public service would be charged for that kind of work. Is that your assessment as well? Well, we didn't take a look at those amounts to determine whether Canadian taxpayers got a bang for their buck when it comes to outsourcing or subcontracting. But what we did determine is that the expenditures on consulting has increased substantially over recent years, and many of those contractors provide services to veterans and First Nations, but there's also been an increase in consultancy when it comes to IT, or policy advice or government stewardship advice, and the public services also increased in size proportionately. And what I've stressed in my appearances before many committees is, why are we using external consultants when there's even more public servants being hired? And so that begs the question, are we hiring the right people if the government is still using these contractors when they're increasing the size of the public service? But more specifically, in response to your question, we haven't determined whether the Canadians are getting bang for their buck. That is the purview of the Auditor General. Thank you for your answer. It was interesting to get an understanding of these two parallel phenomena. It is difficult to understand. We're talking about billions of dollars, $22 billion in contracts awarded to contractors. Are Canadians and Quebecers getting bang for their buck? Or is there duplication here? Are there other cases similar to ArriveCan that, in fact, haven't made the headlines? Well, I wouldn't venture to say that there are other cases similar to ArriveCan. I wouldn't go so far as to say that. But the fact is that there are contractors used to provide policy advice and also management advice in the public service when that expertise already exists within the public service to provide advice and counsel to ministers. And that's somewhat surprising that contractors are used in that domain. Now, the same is true when it comes to providing advice. The public service should be able to do this, but often contractors are relied upon. Are there cases similar to ArriveCan? Well, my office doesn't have the capacity to undertake that kind of assessment, but it's my understanding that the Auditor General is investigating those issues.
Please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to pose questions to you today, Mr. Giroux. Earlier this week, I was speaking with a single mother working full-time along with a side hustle from home, and 100% of her income is covering her mortgage. She relies solely on food banks and her credit card that is maxed. It's getting increasingly difficult. StatsCan report on food insecurity released in November of last year referenced female lone parent families, or single mothers, as one of the highest groups, with 48% experiencing food insecurity. So food insecurity means more than just a child going hungry each week if their parents cannot afford the groceries. Kids experiencing food insecurity are less likely to get the nutrition they need to grow healthy and develop, and they're more likely to develop mental health problems. When food prices go up and there's less money in the household budget, there really are significant impacts on health and wellness. My question to you is the intersection of food inflation and the carbon tax impacting the household budget?
So, a question that is quite valid, but it's something that we have not looked at specifically. So we have done work on the carbon fuel charge, the carbon tax. Sorry if I'm misnaming it. But we have not looked in details at the impact of the fuel charge on food inflation. However, as was referred to a couple of times in this committee, the Bank of Canada has looked at the impact of the fuel charge on general inflation, and so it's 0.15%, if I remember correctly.
So
and
if I may, just
Sure.
to be more specific, are the details based on, are they premised on two people under a roof sharing the load, or on one individual?
when you refer to inflation, inflation refers to, as defined by Statistics Canada, refers to the price evolution of a basket of goods and services that is representative of what a typical household will buy. So
And the typical household is changing.
it is changing, as is the basket of goods and services that they need or they purchase on average. And it's based on surveys and based on consumption patterns. So Statistics Canada is probably a better place to answer how they themselves design their basket of goods
Then
and services.
perhaps I'll switch gears and speak specifically on C-234. You've previously reported that Bill C-234 will save farmers nearly $1 billion by 2030. A more recent costing note by your office estimates that the Senate amendments to the bill will cut carbon tax relief to farmers by $910 billion. Is that accurate?
It probably is a million. I don't have that note in front of me, but there were several amendments to this bill in the Senate, and it's been referred to a couple of times. So forgive me if I don't know all of the details and I don't remember them off the top of my head. But what I remember is that we were talking about less than $1 billion in its last version or latest version.
And speaking more specifically to how the report indicated that the Canadians will pay $486 million in GST on the carbon tax this year and over $1 billion per year in GST by 2030. Do farmers receive any rebates on the GST that they pay on the carbon tax?
My understanding is that farmers are eligible to get back the GST they pay as input tax credits, and also that our analysis for households includes the carbon tax they pay directly, indirectly, as well as the GST that's applied to the carbon tax, direct and indirect.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass it to my colleague.
Thank you. Yeah, I rarely correct you, Mr. Giroux, but on this occasion, I am going to correct you. The governor at Bank of Canada at Finance Committee said it's 0.6% of inflation is directly responsible for carbon tax. It's the increase that's 0.15. So it's 0.6 this year if it were removed, and then ongoing 0.15. And given that after the April 1st increase, if we don't cancel the hike, it'll be nearly 0.8% of inflation. I understand you haven't studied food specifically, but if it's reducing the overall basket of goods by 0.8, it almost certainly has to increase the cost of food. Is that not correct?
Yes, but I would assume that the impact of the carbon tax on the price of food is probably not significant, even though there has been increases in price of food. Not all of it, only a fraction can be attributable to the carbon tax.
Yeah, I think we could maybe split hairs into what that fraction is, but I think though what I want Canadians to leave this meeting with, and I think we agree. You can certainly say differently, but that the carbon tax increases the price of food.
Yes, I would probably say to some extent. But
Thank you very much. Mr. Sousa, please, for 5 minutes. Sorry, you're not coming through, Mr. Sousa. You're not showing muted. Are you plugged in properly? Mr. Sousa, I think we're going to go with Mr. Drouin, and then we'll finish with you.
Yeah.
Well, I think we got you now, Mr. Sousa.
You got me now? All
Please
right.
go ahead for 5.
So I appreciate the discussion that we've been having today, and I recognize that pricing on carbon is being proposed as a great disincentive to our economic growth and activity, when in fact it's the very incentive that's enabling us to invest in other initiatives in the green economy. And it's enabling us to have that drive to do something now to protect future generations as we go forward. And oftentimes when I hear some of these discussions, and I've heard this one in the provincial side in Ontario, when we were deliberating over the price of carbon back in 2015 and 16 to offer an alternative, which we brought forward by way of cap and trade. And we were part of the Western Climate Initiative alongside Quebec and California. And Ontario is netting about $1.5 billion thereabouts annually to reinvest dollar for dollar in the green economy, in retrofits, in home renovations, and enabling us to get a head start on that green economy and in opportunities to support families as we go forward and grow the economy. And it was the alternative. It exempted Ontario from going through a federal carbon pricing system because we already had initiated one. And it wasn't until the Conservative government that came in afterwards that dismantled that very initiative and brought forward a fight with the federal government over something that they lost through a constitutional debate. And in the end, we're faced with this alternative. But many economists are still suggesting and saying that this is a much better and cheaper way to go forward, is pricing carbon. And I appreciate some of the discussion that we've had today because of it, because it's not free. You know, pricing carbon is not something that we can make available to everyone. The greater polluters should be paying their fair share to enable those families, especially those single moms that was just referred to earlier, to net out greater benefit for themselves. And I know and I appreciate your reference to the fact that 4 to 5, 8 out of 10 average families in Canada will benefit through their rebates in respect to this. And while at the same time enabling us to cause the higher polluters to pay their share and provide the incentive now to bring forward a new economy, like we have in Saskatchewan, with the alternative sources of trade that enables us to provide for cleaner alternatives. And that wouldn't exist had we not put these incentives in place in the first place. And to this point, I would like to ask, keeping in mind that many economists have also noted that this is a very cost-effective way to reduce emissions. Ultimately, that's what we're trying to do. Do you believe that those that cause pollution should pay for it?
That's, Mr. Sousa, that's a question for policymakers and legislators.
I'm asking you for your personal interpretation. I'm not asking you as a policyman. I'm asking you personally for future generations. Do you believe those that pollute in rivers, should they be stopping that or paying for it?
As an economist, I believe that externalities should be internalized. So those who cause negative consequences for society should be the ones who assume these costs, as opposed to.
So is carbon pricing an effective way to reduce emissions?
Committee last week. Sorry. As I said to this committee last week, there is a wide consensus among economists, of which I am. I'm an economist, that carbon pricing is an effective way of reducing carbon emissions. And any other way of doing it will also have costs. I've been clear about that, and my office has also been clear about that.
So we just heard about a single mom who is with her kids. She now benefits from a lot of non-taxable benefits, a number of initiatives that the federal government has brought forward to support her in this affordability crisis, all of which has been opposed by the Conservative government. All of these initiatives to try to support that family has actually been opposed on the other side. And I like to nuance some of that recent narrative that's been around the impacts of the price on pollution and affordability, right? We've talked about the Bank of Canada, and the governor is being quoted, and he was quoted as saying that other climate effects and events are also placing a cost on food and a cost in respect to this and its volatility. And we can't just ignore it, put our heads in the sand and pretend it's going to go away. I'm wondering if you agree with the governor on this issue.
On the issue, could you be clear before I agree with something?
The issue is...
Let me interrupt. We're out of time. Can you, if you could just repeat it, Mr. Sousa, and we'll allow time for an answer,
The governor suggested that there are consequences of not putting a price on pollution, wildfires, floods, extreme weather conditions, all place at a price on food.
Climate scientists are almost unanimous in saying that climate change will have impacts on our lives, and I'm willing to believe the science on this one, as on many things.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Sousa. Mrs. Vignola for 2.5, please.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. In a recent report, you referred to the fact that the carbon tax, the impact of the carbon tax on inflation was about 0.15%. Now, if inflation is 3%. Now, the inflation rate has been higher than that. It's going back down to something more reasonable, but let's assume that the inflation rate is around 3%. Does that mean that 0.15% is it of the 3%, or is it 2.85% inflation plus 0.15? Well, if you're talking about the impact of inflation, if we do take for granted that it is that amount, that percentage, well, inflation will be a tad higher because of the carbon tax. Now, an inflation rate without the carbon tax, 2.85%, with the carbon tax, 3%. I see. Well, let's say I had something that I bought for $100 before inflation, and it's an additional 3% because of inflation, so $103. So 15 cents is the result of the carbon tax. Now, it's a whole lot less than the Quebec sales tax, for example. Yes, that's true, but there are two things to bear in mind. Inflation is an annual phenomenon. We compare the prices compared to a year ago. So the prices increased over the course of that year, but there's also the cumulative effect. For example, if you completely scrap a tax, well, you eliminate the effects of previous years. There'll be a sudden drop, but not a recurring drop, yes, but it will have a direct impact on inflation. Now, if I look at your table on Canada healthcare transfers that is calculated on a per capita basis. Now, the question that crossed my mind is this. Does that calculation factor in refugee claimants when it comes to the number of residents in Quebec or in any particular Canadian province? Well, I don't have the answer to that specific question. It's an interesting question, given everything that we're hearing in the news, but I know that it would be based on census data, but I'm not sure whether it would include non-residents when it comes to Canada healthcare transfers. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson.
Mr. Boulis, please, for 2.5, sir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. And thanks again to the witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Giroux, we've spoken at length today about a price on pollution, inflation, and also the climate crisis, and whether or not the climate crisis has an impact on our communities from a public health standpoint, floods, forest fires, droughts, etc., etc. Is it possible to get our hands on an overall assessment of the economic impact, the financial cost to the federal government with this effects of climate change that are just increasing exponentially over the recent years? Well, that's a worthwhile question to look at, but it's not a question that my office actually did look at, i.e. the specific cost to the federal government of climate change. And I know that it's a matter of interest for many institutions in Canada, and also globally. But for the time being, our work is at an embryonic stage. We're just starting the process of estimating those costs, and it's subject to interpretation, and many people will question, well, I'm interested in my political party because we're talking here about the cost to consumers, for an industry, for individuals, but inertia, inaction also comes with a cost. And I think oftentimes we tend to forget this. Earlier you said that market mechanisms, such as a price on pollution or a carbon tax, do have incentivizing effects on consumers to change their behaviour. Now, based on your assessments in recent years, will that measure alone be enough for the federal government to attain our greenhouse gas emissions objectives. Response. We did a report on that in 2022, and I have a lot of documents right here on the table. I think it was November 2022, if I'm not mistaken, but we did analyze that issue, and we realized, like most observers, that the fuel tax and CO2 emissions tax, i.e. the carbon tax, is not enough to attain the Paris objectives or even exceed them as the government undertook to do in the 2021 budget. So other initiatives and measures are required, which the government did announce in order to obtain the objectives that it set for itself. For example, the fact that, well, the carbon tax will enable us to reach 33.3% of our greenhouse gas emissions targets. So from memory, they're the findings that we have at this stage. Thank you.
Chambers, welcome to OGGO. Go ahead, please, sir, for 5.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. Appreciate you being here with your colleagues, Ms. Giswald and Ms. van der Wees. I'd like to talk about everybody's favorite tax, the underused housing tax. Mr. Giroux, I'm not sure you are able to follow all of the inquiries of ministry, but just last week, the government tabled documents that showed since 2022, the federal government has spent upwards of $59 million on administering the underused housing tax.
Sorry, Mr. Chambers, I have to interrupt for a second. We're being told your microphone's not connected properly to your computer.
I apologize, Mr. Chair. I believe that's likely a little bit better.
Yeah, we're fine now. Go ahead, sir.
My apologies to the interpreters. Mr. Giroux, we were told by the CRA that they've spent upwards of $59 million administering the tax, but have only assessed $49 million worth of amounts owing. That's not collections, by the way, that's amounts owing. I'm just curious if you recall from your previous work, do you recall what the government expected to collect from that tax in the first couple of years?
You're right, Mr. Chambers, that with a team of 38, we cannot follow every single government initiatives. I don't remember off the top of my head how much the government was expected to collect on the underused housing tax. And I'm looking at my colleagues and they're avoiding eye contact. So it probably means they don't remember either. But it seems to be high to have numbers such as the ones you mentioned, that it would be costing so much to administer versus how much is assessed, which is often a significantly different number than what ends up being collected.
Thank you very much. My understanding is they expected to collect $200 million in the first year and about $165 million every year thereafter. If that is the case, and their experience is that they're only assessing $49 million worth of penalties, should the government take what effectively would be a write-down in that to adjust what is projected to assess and collect for future years, since it's not bringing in what they believe?
If the amounts assessed so far are indeed the final numbers or are indicative of what the government is expected to collect overall, I think there'll need to be a correction in the budget in terms of revenues to be collected. So if that's indeed the case, and it's not just the initial collection efforts that have had some difficult times getting underway, then we should see that reflected in the fiscal plan when the minister tables the budget in April, on April 16.
Thank you very much. Do you believe that it's appropriate, or should the CRA, when implementing a new tax like this, consider the costs of compliance on taxpayers
with respect to the amount of direction or clarification that they provide taxpayers? Is that something they should be considering? There was an article yesterday that suggested that taxpayers are paying anywhere between $500 and $1,000 or more per filing of the underused housing tax paperwork, which they have to do every year.
It certainly would be a good idea in terms of policy making for the CRA to introduce that into the equation when I say CRA, but CRA and the Department of Finance, when they're briefing the minister or ministers and cabinet, ultimately to introduce new tax measures, to have an idea, or at least provide an idea to the ministers as to how much the burden will be on individuals and businesses. And also, I know they do that. They probably also they include the number of employees they'll need to administer these new taxes or amended tax provisions. So it's data that would certainly be possible to have at least an order of magnitude when introducing new measures such as the underused housing tax.
Thank you very much. Last question. I want to thank you very much for the work you've done on tracking departmental spending plans and the impacts on the government's people plan. The government continues to send legislation to this parliament with no projections on the impact on people, and yet your office is the only office that shows consistently time after time the government suggests a people projection and fails to meet it every single time. In fact, the numbers go up every year instead of down as they project. How do you recommend parliamentarians get a better handle on or require more transparency for the government on its people plan?
A brief answer if you're able to.
Having more clarity as to exactly how many employees initiatives will require for their proper administration would be a good first step. And also the employee impact of reallocation measures would certainly be a good impact. But I'll stop there for lack of time. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks. Mr. Drouin, please, for 5 or so.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And just to inform you, we'd like to raise something before you put that gavel down. So just to after I'm done, merci beaucoup. Merci beaucoup à notre.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to our Officer of Parliament, who always does a great job. I'd like to talk about the 22nd of November 2022 report. No, sorry, 2022 report, yes. The report where you analysed the impact of climate change on Canada's GDP. And I think that you arrived at the conclusion that it was about 1% as a result solely of climate change. Could you elaborate on that, please? The analysis that you did on climate change's impact on the GDP of Canada. Do you actually remember? Well, I don't have that good a memory because we produce many reports each and every year, but I do have the report actually here. So our estimations based on external sources, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is that there were temperature changes to the tune of 0.9 degrees surface temperatures, an increase in precipitation compared to the 1991 and 2010 averages, and that has already reduced the GDP by 2.08%. And the ongoing effects of climate change will further reduce GDP by an additional 1.6% in the upcoming years. And we've based that on a number of hypotheses, factoring in climate mitigation efforts and subject to the objectives being met. Now, what about your most recent report on the price of pollution? And I think that my colleague, Mr. Husmerchuk, mentioned this earlier, but I just want to get a handle on this. When you conduct an economic impact analysis, are you presupposing that there are no technological advancements over that decade? Well, there are a number of variables, and they're not constant variables. Our modelling, in fact, does factor in climate change, and changes in technology. But this study is through till 2030, which is kind of a short time frame for Canada's economy. And what's often mentioned in briefings is that nothing points to the fact that there would be an economic advantage after 2030, but between now and 2030, those costs are measurable, and the benefits of a transition to a less carbon-intensive economy will still not be fully implemented. We have time. This process is quite quick, but we haven't yet incorporated the new technologies that will help to offset the damage caused by climate change. We have relative data concerning on the use of fossil fuels, and if we eliminate them quickly, well, there is an upshot to that. There's stranded assets that would be taken out of circulation before their normal end-of-life cycle. So to a large extent, that explains the costs. Question. Most economists are going to say, and there are Nobel Prize winners who've said this, that they say that it's important to have a price on carbon. It indicates to the market, this is the direction we're heading in. If you use X, Y, or Z product and it's carbon intensive, you're going to pay the price. And consumers understand. They know that, they're better off if they buy an electric vehicle because they know that they're not going to have to pay for gas, for example. Now, in your analyses, do you look at those kinds of factors? Response. Well, we do take into account behavioural aspects in our modelling. For example, the impact of a carbon tax that is maintained and actually increases. But as I said, we're talking about a 5 or a 6 year time frame, and that's not enough to offset for the negative impacts to be offset by the positive impacts. But we nevertheless need to have some kind of planning, to have some kind of certainty, and that would demonstrate that there are benefits to carbon pricing.
Inform farmers that they are eligible for a part of the rebate for the price on pollution that they pay. It's not the full price, but it's up to $1.86 per farm expense. So I'm just encourage them to sign up, as it's not the full price. And I'm sure my colleague, Mr. Lawrence, and obviously Ms. Cramp-Newman, who have farmers in their area, would encourage them to sign up. So merci. Thank you, Chair.
That was a wonderful plug, even if it was a few seconds over. And thank you for joining OGGO and making that plug. We should charge you attendance fee for that. With that, we thank Mr. Giroux, Ms. Griswold, and Ms. Van der Rees, as always, for joining us. Appreciate your time. And I think Mr. Sousa.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'd just like to confirm the motion that was brought forward earlier today, outlining the procedures and process by which we proceed going forward. And I've not received any idea. There's no one on this committee that's been notified of a meeting anytime soon. We don't know what witnesses are coming before us. So I just want to confirm with the committee and with you that, in fact, we have no more meetings this week. Is that correct?
No
and
meeting.
I want the committee to, and I want the members to engage here.
Yeah, notice is out for the meeting tomorrow, Mr. Sousa.
Pardon me?
The meeting notice is out already for tomorrow and went out before today started.
But that's not now in compliance. Is that correct? You don't have agreement here.
No, I believe it is in compliance. My understanding, looking at the motion, we have future meetings as well that we have booked for both the NDP study on Canada Post. We've got the red tape reduction meeting booked with witnesses. I assume that we look at the motion as for future ones that we are starting, that we will follow this.
Yes, I don't think we're aware of that. I think we don't have consent, Mr. Chair, to proceed for tomorrow, given that we've not provided notice and we're still not aware of who the witnesses are. Who are the witnesses tomorrow? That's not even been discussed.
It's on the notice, Mr. Sousa. If you look at the notice, you will see who's been booked. And again, it went out before the meeting started.
I think there is a lack of desire to proceed without having prior consultation as a result of the motion that we brought forward today. And I suspect that we are going to request that we cancel the meeting for tomorrow as a result of the violation of the privileges to the members of this committee who have not been notified appropriately.
Okay, well, thank you. I've got several others speaking. I have Mr. Chambers, then Mr. Kuzmierczuk, then Ms. Atwin.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Look, my view is the notice has already gone out for tomorrow before we pass that motion. So if the member or the government members wanted to be very clear, the motion they brought forward was actually silent on what we were supposed to do about tomorrow. They could have easily made that clarification at that time. And so I leave the discretion to you as the discretion of the chair, which is used at every other committee, by the way. You know, to the extent that the government members are upset about this, perhaps they should be careful because it's their committee chairs at other committees who take much greater liberties with the standing orders with respect to this.
Thanks, and I appreciate it. And I will note out again, you know, for example, actually both upcoming studies, we've had to extend witnesses, and actually I've also had to go in and fill witnesses for both an NDP and Liberal study. So it has happened before where I've had to go out and find witnesses. But again, Mr. Chambers is right. It did go out before that. But go ahead, Mr. Kuzmierczuk.
Yeah, I was just going to say, again, I disagree with how the meeting tomorrow that's scheduled was organized. We were not consulted. We were provided no opportunities for instruction. There was no consultation. There was no discussion. It doesn't provide us the time we need to prepare for an important meeting. Every meeting is important, but especially meetings such as that one with the witnesses. And this is not how we've conducted business in the 5 years that I have been on committee. And so I am simply registering my absolute wholehearted disagreement with the way all of these meetings have been scheduled this week. And it is not aligned with the motion that we passed earlier in today. And I want to register my complete disagreement and disappointment with how these last three meetings have been organized, completely without any consultation input from this committee. Thank you.
Ms. Atwin?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to reiterate what my colleagues have shared, reading in a global news article that we were going to have a meeting Thursday, really disappointing. It defeats the collaborative atmosphere that I think we're all trying to achieve here. We have really important work to do. I think we very much were distracted from that important work today, and on our focus on main estimates, it kind of went down a path that it shouldn't have. And I see that will be the case for tomorrow as well. I just really think, again, that OGGO is a very important committee. You state this yourself at the beginning of our meetings all the time, the only committee that matters. So let's proceed in a way that's respectful of all of our time, of our constituency time as well. This has happened repeatedly now since Christmas. It's really important to me to connect with my community. And so that, for me, is a big piece that's missing here as well. But again, to read about a committee meeting and witnesses in a global news article, what happened there, Mr. Chair? I mean, we really need to have an atmosphere of respect here, and I'd like to see it return to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll address that before I get to you, Mr. Sousa. Very clearly, I do not talk to Globe, whoever you're referring to. I saw on Twitter our Premier Higgs talking about it, but that's him talking about it, not the committee. So, Mr. Sousa?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, given the discussions that we're having, maybe it's appropriate just to put forward a motion again, given the lack of consultations and lack of advisement to us and the violation of our privileges as members. If all agree, I'd like to put forward a motion that we cancel tomorrow's meeting.
Before I get to that, it's not a violation of privileges for the chair to book, and I'm happy to actually read the exact wording for everyone from the big green book, but appreciate what you're saying, but appreciate we also stick to kind of the facts. It's not a violation of your privileges for me as chair to book a meeting.
It appears everyone else seems to know about these meetings before us. including the premiers and including witnesses that are being applied.
This might come as a shock to you, Mr. Sousa, but witnesses can't be called until...
Again, without consultation and without discussion with this, and we have other priorities that we were looking at going forward, and you haven't made those happen. You have not advanced the other
Point of
issues.
order, I believe there's a motion on the floor.
Yeah, I was just stating, I guess, correcting Mr. Sousa, you can argue as you wish, and that's fine. I appreciate that. I appreciate all sides to this, and I appreciate your feelings on this, but it's your privileges have not been violated. For example, we invited witnesses for a Liberal study because none of the Liberals had put forward witnesses. That is not a violation of your privileges. But I understand what you're saying. I just wanted to clear that one point because I think it's an important one. Yeah. We will start a speaking order. Hold on 2 seconds. So this is on...
Just a point of order there, Mr. Chair.
Before we get to that, we are on Mr. I see Mr. Drouin has his hand up, but we're going to get to Mr. Sousa's motion just brought in. But I have a point of order first, Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, we are not currently in committee business, and this is not of the subject matter, and so I believe that this motion is out of order.
I appreciate that, Mr. Lawrence, but I understand procedurally it is. Mr. Kuzmierczak, on Mr. Sousa's motion or a different issue?
Yes, on this motion. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, sir.
Mr. Chair, the trust that is fundamental to the work of this committee has been broken. The principle of collaboration that underpins all of our work here on Parliament Hill and in this committee has been broken. And I turn to you, sir, and I say that this is an opportunity here today for us and for you to begin the work of repairing that trust and repairing that relationship that is broken. And I do place that on your shoulders, sir. And what I would recommend is that you work together with the members of all parties around this table, as you've done in the past, to work together with all the members around this table to pick a date, to pick a time that works for this committee. If it's the will of this committee to bring those witnesses forward and to have this discussion, then work with us, Mr. Chair, work with us, as has been your tradition at the beginning of your term as the chair of this committee. And so I ask you to work to repair this trust, repair this relationship. Let's put this committee back on track and let's rebuild that relationship and that trust. And I believe it begins today with this motion, sir. And I ask you to consider the objections that this committee has brought forward publicly about the way that we've been conducting business here over the last several weeks. And I ask that you help us, again, rebuild the trust. Let's rebuild the relationship, and let's put this committee back on track. And I ask you for that, sir. And I look to your leadership on that.
Thanks. I have Mrs. Vignola, then Mr. Drouin.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Well, I tend to agree with the motion that was moved by the Liberals, which doesn't happen that often, I might add. Now, normally I have something to say to Liberal motions, and I try to, in fact, foster a consensus. I'm patient. In fact, I'm surprised at how patient I am, to be honest. I am a straight shooter. I'm an open book. I really think that being frank is important. And unlike what many people say about politics, and when I was elected, well, politics is not a game. Politics is about service. And politics is not about reading budgets cover to cover. about reading pieces of legislation and bills cover to cover, doing the requisite research to really get a handle on issues and to be well informed without having a bias, and ask questions of experts and get their points of view. When people write to me and they don't understand, well, I respond to them, here's the point of view of the Bloc, here's the New Democrat standpoint, here's the Liberal standpoint, and because all of those combined help to inform our voters. Now, right now, at this juncture, I think there are folks taking politics, seeing politics as if it were a game. And as politicians, which is not a game, you know, this is not a game, as I said. We are trying to achieve things that are important for all Canadians, all Quebecers, and of course, part and parcel of this is looking after our constituents in our ridings, and it's really tough to do this when, at the very last moment, we are called to a committee meeting. And listen, I've been, you know, I've been a good player here. But I have had to push back meetings. I've acted in good faith, but I've had to push back meetings, and it's not because of these witnesses appearing tomorrow. Of course, they're entitled to appear if they want to appear, but we need enough time to give them a proper welcome and to have time to research and to really get a handle on the files at question. For example, New Brunswick and how its role vis-a-vis the federal government. That is, you know, and when you get a notice of less than 24 hours, I can't turn on a dime. I can't turn on a dime. You know, there are bloody limits here, and I'm sorry, I'm using the word bloody because I don't want to use more unparliamentary language that's harsher than the word bloody. So yes, I'm going to support this motion. Calling for, respectfully, that this meeting be postponed to later so that we can be better prepared, so that we can better study the issues at hand, and so that we can meet these witnesses, listen to these witnesses. These premiers are not puppets. They shouldn't be used as political pawns and puppets, and the onus is on us to show them the respect that is due to them and to be well prepared for our line of questioning. So I support this motion.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président et Madame.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And Ms. Vignola, I guess it's because I'm here that you're supporting my motion. We've worked so well together collaboratively in the past. I say that facetiously.
Obviously, you can see where this is going. We will have to deal with this tomorrow. And if the motion, we wouldn't be dealing with this today, we'd have to deal with this tomorrow. The majority of the members are not in accordance with what has transpired, and I'm not going to judge anything. I have respect for you, Mr. Chair, but obviously you are at the command of the majority of the members, and I think on our side we're ready to vote.
Mr. Lawrence?
Thank you very much, and I think that it's important to put some context into the meeting today. When we look at the carbon tax, we heard today testimony from the PBO. We've heard testimony from the Governor of Bank of Canada, both nonpartisan experts in their respective field, that the carbon tax is in fact causing individuals to go hungry. It's causing children to not be able to eat at night and go to bed hungry. This is a significant issue. And so my understanding of it, and I could be wrong, I have no inside information, but my understanding of it is that the premiers wrote to the Finance Committee and asked before the April 1st, when the carbon tax is set to increase by 23%. We don't have much time here, so we can postpone and live in an imaginary world where this doesn't exist, but it does. We have April 1st deadline. They wrote to the Finance Committee, the Liberal Finance Committee, and he deemed it that it was inappropriate, that somehow the premiers, that millions of Canadians should not have a voice, that we should just all sit here and watch children not be able to eat at night because it might upset our schedule? Are you kidding me? How out of touch?
Hey,
we are here. Hey,
hold on. What about
everyone to just take it
I'm
down a
sorry,
bit.
but je ne mangeais pas je ne mangeais.
Listen, I missed meals, sometimes a whole day's meals, and the carbon tax didn't exist back then. Now, is the carbon tax really doing all of this? Can we get back to brass tacks? It's important to hear from premiers, but it's important to not use them as political pawns, and I would like to put people on notice in that regard.
Thanks. Before we continue, we just remind everyone of your voice levels with our interpreters, please.
My
Mr.
apologies,
Lawrence, please.
my apologies to the interpreter. But I'm not apologizing for my comments because they represent the reality. We heard today from the parliamentary budget officer that the carbon tax is increasing food. We're facing an affordability crisis. I met yesterday with a single mom, has a couple kids, whose mortgage eats up her entire paycheck. So she has to use a food bank. Like, this is not a laughing matter. This is serious, guys. And premiers wrote to the Finance Committee, and the Liberal chair decided that their voice wasn't important, that the millions of Canadians that they represent didn't count. And so, yes, our chair followed proper parliamentary procedure and called a meeting so that the premiers, the leaders of millions of Canadians, could testify from New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, from Saskatchewan, from Alberta. I'm sorry that we had to move around our schedules. I know that we're all very busy, but millions of Canadians want to express their view that the carbon tax is hurting families and it's hurting Canadians. And so, yes, I don't think it's asking too much for 12 members of Parliament to move around their schedule for their voices to be heard. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Anyone else wish to speak on this? Sorry, is Mr. Yeah, I'll get you. Yeah, I'll get to Mrs. Vignola and Mr. Lawrence. Did we get Mr. Backrack checked in? Are you joining us and we're losing Mr. Bouleraise?
Hi, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I don't have my headphones.
Okay, we'll recognize thumb up or thumb down for you then.
Thanks.
Yeah, Mrs. Vignola, then Mr. Lawrence.
J'inviterai Monsieur Lawrence à mettre son écoute.
Well, I'd like Mr. Lawrence to put on his headset because previously, before I put my colleague on notice regarding the fact that we don't need, it doesn't have to be just due to a carbon tax that people can't pay their rent or they have to skip meals, because I actually did both of those things for years. And there wasn't a carbon tax back then. But honestly, we need to be respectful towards our witnesses. We need to really dive deep into the issues that they're experts on before we question them. It's not just a matter of having people showed up who've been who've been asking to see us for months. It's a matter of respect towards the witnesses. I know that the 1st of April is on the horizon, and it's not April Fool's here that I'm referring to. But the fact of the matter is, we need to be respectful towards our premiers, their valuable time, which is just as invaluable as ours is, if not more, and whether it be a premier from a Canadian province or the province of Quebec, they have a hell of a lot of responsibilities, and so we need to be respectful towards them. I don't think that my 80-hour shift of per week suggests that I'm lazy, and the reason I'm speaking now against having these meetings is because I'm lazy. It's not about that. I work hard. It's